Good morning. How's everybody? I too am here from the government and here to help. A sobering thought. Like Dr. Blazer said, I have worked in the lower Mississippi Valley for about the last 17 years, and I've recently become the state forester for NRCS in Texas about 4.5 months ago. I'm going to try today to share with you some of the lessons we have learned in the lower Mississippi Valley over the last 18 to 20 years, and particularly in relation to establishment of hardwood stands by artificial regeneration. And I hope that we can understand that there have been mistakes made in the past. We have learned lessons from those mistakes, and as we move forward, we can all share ideas and concepts that will help us do a better job of hardwood stand establishment. The Western Gulf Coastal Plain region is 37 million acres in this particular map, and this is a land use map that the Nature Conservancy has, and I'm not going to dwell on that, just a quick snapshot of the region. I'm going to go to this grayscale, which I like a little bit better, showing the same thing basically. A little bit easier to see the state lines. Just for NRCS purposes, I'm going to share with you a little bit. The major land resource area right in here, the upper and main part of the coastal plain, is called our major land resource area 133, and the coastal flatwoods, this area right across here, is called 152B. And our soil scientists have completed mapping in both of those areas. The 152B area is one that they are writing the ecological site descriptions for at present. And hopefully in the next couple of years we will have a lot of useful information that ties soils and climate and plant communities together in both of these regions. The thing in the past, as many of you know about the soil survey, it ties site index and plant productivity, if you will, or forest productivity to a soil series or a soil type. Our new approach on that is to use a concept called ecological site descriptions. And so nationwide, NRCS is working with this concept, and hopefully we'll be able to tell you the past vegetation communities, the present vegetation communities under the current climate, and some prediction of future vegetation communities under different management regimes or scenarios. Okay? So I hope some of you or all of you are familiar with Web Soil Survey and how to use it. That is a very valuable tool that gets away from the old hard copy paper soil surveys that we've been familiar with over the years. Web Soil Survey allows you to make a polygon or digitize your area of interest, and you can look up the soil series on a particular tract of land that you're working on. This is the annual precipitation map that shows these rainfall bands, and following the climate presentation by Dr. McNulty is hopefully going to help this just a little bit. If you notice, a big part of the Western Gulf region is in that 50 to 70 inch rainfall band. But only when you get into this area right in here, as you move west, you start getting some drier sites, conditions based on annual rainfall. The rule of thumb has always been in the lower Mississippi Valley that it's okay to move seed source 100, I think my placer pointer just went crazy on me. Let me try this one. There we go. 100 miles north or south is okay. If you need to move seed sources, that it's okay to do that. And we've sort of worked with that concept for the last 18 or 20 years. East to west, as you can see, we're still in a pretty good situation as far as rainfall. in the lower Mississippi Valley. But when you start getting over here, as you move further west, it gets drier. So I just want to point out that if you're going to do reforestation, a local seed source that reflects the rainfall and the climate in the area where you're working has always been my experience. Try to stick with that local seed source and don't move things around too far. If you have a project planned to do bottomland hardwood reforestation, or upland for that matter, getting the right seedlings from the nursery that reflect that seed source ahead of time is very important. A lead time of a couple of years out is something that I would share with you that the government in its big programs like CRP and WRP has never really pushed. We get into this real-time mode. We have to have seedlings. We have to plant these acres. We've got program deadlines. We have money that's obligated. We have to spend it, and the private sector works differently than that. If you tell a landowner, or you have a tract, if you're working for industry or something of private nature, you can actually plan your project 1 to 2 years out and get the seedlings that you probably need exactly for that site. And that keeps you from having to buy what's available at the nursery, just run-of-the-mill. And as you get into this western Gulf Coast region, I would think, just from my experience, that getting the target seedling that you need for the purpose might be a good approach, something to plan ahead, a little bit of planning there. This tract right here is just west of Monroe, Louisiana, not very far away. It's an 80-year-old stand of mixed hardwoods with some pine scattered up on the ridge tops. This is a Darley soil down that side slope, and if you notice, these white oaks right here have some really good form to them. And these trees have developed under natural stand dynamics over the last 80 years. This is not a planted stand. But in mimicking natural stand dynamics, that's something we never did think about when we started on these large-scale programs like WRP. And the effort was to put back as much hard mass on the ground as possible. And no thought given to the light-seeded species either. They'll come in on their own, they'll float in with backwater, whatever. Animals will distribute them. And when you're looking at a natural stand like this, you realize that these trees have grown under conditions of competition for many years, and they've had to fight to get to that sunlight. And you get a lot better stem form, and you get height growth and good bole wood that not only satisfies the need for timber production, but it also makes very good wildlife habitat. And one thing we've learned in dealing with these big programs like WRP and CRP, that it takes very little additional effort to plan and grow trees for wildlife or timber. The two seem to work together very well if you just tweak it a little bit in either direction. And I realize that the Wetland Reserve Program, with which I've worked for some 17 years, is focused mainly on wildlife. And if you mention timber production around any of our biologists, they get a little bit jittery. But I'm going to show you a slide here in just a second that I think will illustrate the point. Another natural stand dynamic picture here. This is from Brian Lockhart's work over at Noxubee National Wildlife Refuge. Some of you may have seen these stands. We were on a tour about 4 years ago, I think. This is a row of sweet gums right here, another row of sweet gum right there, and then the oak gum alternating row here in the middle. These are on an 8x8 spacing. And as you can tell, that cherry bark oak right there has, at age 21 or 2, has got some really good form to it. And as these stands start out, the sweet gum dominates the site, and After about 17 or 18 years, those oaks begin to become canopy dominants. They get above the sweet gum, and they really take off and put on some good height growth. So if you want to clean up that bowl, you need that lateral competition and make it pretty tight. The traditional approach to bottomland hardwoods has been a 12 by 12 foot spacing, which is 302 trees per acre. And we've learned that some of those trees really aren't too pretty. There's a direct seeding stand north of Vicksburg that was done with acorns, direct seeded, about 1988. And if you notice, it's pretty much a biological desert in terms of ground cover or understory, mid-story, whatever. It's all one species, it's all nut all oak. So that's what happens when you get what you wish for. You wanted hard mast on the landscape, and guess what? You got it. You got a lot of limbs, you got a lot of trees with stress cracks, you have an overstock stand that's needing some treatment, and now you have to explain to the landowner that something went wrong. We either were using the wrong approach or it worked too good. So this is what I would hope that the take-home message is: do not plant an oak monoculture and expect it to develop into something that looked like that first slide that I showed you. Let me go back just a little bit. This particular tree right here is a cherry bark. These were planted on a 25 by 25 foot spacing at one of the wildlife management areas up in West Tennessee. That picture was made in 1997. I think those trees were planted in 1977. And the WMA guys were just curious to see, hey, let's try something, see if it works. They didn't have any herbicides to use. They raked and hoed and did mechanical weeding and cleaning and kept the ground clean for 20, 25 foot circle around these trees for several years. You've got limbs all the way to the ground, and some of these limbs are sticking out 12 or 15 feet from the main stem of the tree, and it's limby all the way up. And this one's down in the woods a little bit too, so it's not just an open grown tree that's on the edge. So yes, they were shooting for wildlife habitat, but they lost the stem form, and you get a tree that just doesn't have good apical control. It's just not growing from that terminal position like it should be. Here again, this is Yazoo National Wildlife Refuge. As you can see, limbs everywhere, direct seeded stand back in the late 80s, probably 87, 88. They've got the same thing, no deer browse, no real shrub layer, no herbaceous layer. The stratification of that stand is just not taking place. So here again, an oak monoculture, not good. Fish and Wildlife Services had to spend money going in and shredding these stands and treating them to try to put gaps and openings in there to get some desirable wildlife habitat. They've also tried to have firewood cuts where they advertise free firewood giveaways. Nobody comes to even cut firewood. So it's a kind of an interesting concept that you've planted a stand here and you've got something that's really just not as usable for wildlife habitat or timber production as you would like. Let's see right here. Here is a stand that was planted in 1988 just on the other side of Monroe, Louisiana. The pink flags are the cherry bark oaks. The chartreuse or light green flags are the gums. This is one that NRCS planted on a 12 by 12 spacing. Still not as tight as we would like to see, but at least you're getting some self-pruning, but these oaks are still hanging on to some limbs right here, as you can see in the foreground of that picture. The thing I want to try to make a point about, these oaks that you'll be working with in the Western Gulf region, and they're out of some 19 species, 19 or 20 species that are pretty common, about 12 of which are oaks in the Western Gulf region. These trees can all tolerate a little bit more shade than we normally talk about. These oaks only need about 48 to 50% full sun. So when you're planting from artificial regen, it's okay to use trainer trees on each side of your oaks, and it's okay to alternate your oaks in a row. And I realize that there's a lot of movement out there these days about the cottonwood and the interplanting for carbon sequestration and that type of thing. And I've worked with a good bit of that over the last 3 years or so in Mississippi. Cottonwood is a desirable trainer tree on the right site, but on a lot of these western Gulf sites, you're going to be out of the range of cottonwood, and for soil species matchup, site species suitability, sweet gum is probably going to be a lot better trainer tree in many instances because you get so much natural sweet gum regen, and just look at your natural stand dynamics. And I would like to say that from light-seeded species standpoint, we have other species that we can plant. Green ash seems to be dropping out of the picture. A lot of Brian Lockhart's work revolves around sweet gum, but he does have a list on one of his publications about the suitability of various light-seeded species for trainer trees. It's something to consider, and take a look at that before you plan your reforestation project. Steps in the process. If you're going to plan a reforestation project, bottomland hardwood seedlings, I mentioned a minute ago getting your nursery on key to grow the target seedling that you need. There's been a lot of debate over the years about larger seedlings versus smaller seedlings. I have always been a believer in the 3/8 inch seedling spec. Emil Gardner and I over at the Hardwoods lab at Stoneville have worked and collaborated fairly closely over the last 17 years. And 2 years ago, we had a hardwood seedling workshop in Greenwood, Mississippi at the NRCS area office, and we brought all of the stakeholders in, FSA, NRCS, Fish and Wildlife Service, and we explored this in a good bit of detail. It was an all-day long meeting. And Emil has got some very good data that shows that the 3/8 inch hardwood seedlings will outperform the 1/4 inch seedlings. Number of first order lateral roots is important, and the way that they are planted and handled is very important. He has a graded seedling study, some 26,000 or 29,000 seedlings that they put into categories based on the number of first order lateral roots and the height and the species, and they planted them very carefully so they could measure each seedling as they were put into those categories. And the thing that's interesting about this, the larger seedlings exhibit planting check the first couple of years. It appears quite frequently that you're having a failure based on the larger seedlings dying back. But you go back 5 to 7 years later, and you find out that it's those smaller seedlings that could not handle all of that weed competition, and they're the ones that really drop out, and that's where you see the mortality. Another thing about seedling quality and size is that it's very specific about species. Green ash, for example, you can almost throw one down on the sidewalk and stomp it into the crack in the sidewalk and it'll grow. So the seedling size thing doesn't enter into it with every species. But if you're going to plant multiple species on a site to get a mixed stand, you need to be aware of the seedling morphology. Not all seedlings grow to a 3/8 inch root collar diameter very easily in the first year. That's why you need to know your nursery, work with your nurseryman to get the type of seedling that you need. Matching up species to site. This first item right here. The Baker and Broadfoot Site Evaluation Guide is very handy, and I'm not going to go into all of the nuances of that here today because that's pretty much a couple of hour process walking you through the table and how to score those points in those categories. But just suffice it to say that book is available online, and understanding how to use the Baker Broadfoot Site Evaluation Guide is real important. But the ecological site descriptions that I mentioned earlier that NRCS is creating is also going to be a new method that we have in our toolbox to match species to site. Hopefully within the next year or two, that's going to be a really valuable tool, something we've not had before. Okay? Proper site preparation. Now, I've worked largely on ag lands, former ag lands that have been put into conservation programs. Early on in 96, 97, 98, 99, those years, the process was to bush hog it, start planting trees the next day. We didn't look at any other issues related to site prep. We did not do any subsoiling. We did not do any herbaceous weed control using chemicals. Lessons learned, subsoiling has come into the picture in a big way, and the use of the Ecotil subsoiler has changed the way we do bottomland hardwood reforestation dramatically. I'm going to show you a slide or two here in just a minute about that. Also, the use of chemicals, oust, for example, spraying it over the rip after the rip is sealed. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Also, careful handling and storage of seedlings. Going to get to that, and proper planting method. Let's move forward here just a minute. Not every site has compaction. Ag lands, we didn't factor this in early on. About 12 years ago, we started using the cone penetrometer to take some compaction measurements. And we found out in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, that virtually every site had compaction around 12 to 14 inches down from years of agricultural traffic in the same row pattern. Now, I realize that over here in the western Gulf Coastal Plain, you probably are not going to be dealing with a lot of the same abandoned agricultural fields like we dealt with in the lower Mississippi Valley. But I do want to caution you, an investment in that penetrometer may not be a waste of money. It may be valuable because past logging machinery, past land use even from farming many years ago, if this land was in agricultural use, there may still be some compaction, and these sites will fool you. So probing with that penetrometer is not a bad expenditure of time and money. That gadget only cost about $200. And when you get readings above 300 pounds per square inch, you need to be thinking about subsoiling. Matter of fact, we have gotten to where now in the lower Mississippi Valley, everybody routinely subsoils. We don't take our penetrometer to the field anymore. So it's that important. And here's why. If you've got this compacted layer down there about 12 to 14 inches, you need to get below that layer. You need to rip or shatter that compacted layer down to here to really make it practical to plant that hardwood seedling. And why is that? Hardwood seedlings have a larger root system than pines. And they have to spread out, and they don't need to be balled or L-rooted or J-rooted. They need to be planted properly and get those lateral roots below the ground and seal that planting slit. And we have found that survival second, third year out is about 20 to 30% better on these subsoil sites. And I don't know of anybody that wouldn't opt for better survival with their planting job. Okay? The compacted layer is easy to find when you're using that penetrometer. You want to make sure that you get below it a couple of inches when you're ripping it. The Ecotil subsoiler runs about 14 to 16 inches deep, and it seems to hit ideally in this zone on most of these ag fields. And we'll talk about that just in a minute. Let me get to that slide. There are many variations of subsoiling tools and implements out there. And I'm not going to say that one size fits all. There's a really good publication that is available, and I'll share this reference with you from the U.S. Forest Service that talks about different types of subsoiling implements, whether you use the winged or not, or whether you use a straight shank or not. This one here is called an Ecotil. It's got a tiger point, and we call it the bat wing or the sweep back type subsoiling shank. If you want to be able to get your trees in the ground, you need to be thinking something about like this to make it work properly. And particularly if you've got compaction. That's just something that's really come out in the last 10 to 12 years and when we rip every site. If you want to avoid this type of thing, you come back 2 years later and a landowner tells you my trees are dead, and you go out there and you look and you say, well, we planted them but we didn't subsoil it. This work's too expensive to do, and it's too much invested on the front end to not do it right. And even here you've got all of the lateral root mass pointing up like that. These trees were crammed into a slit that was too small and wasn't deep enough. And you just don't want to see something like that 2 years down the road. And explaining that to a landowner is not easy to do either. A couple of other slides here. This is one of the variations on the winged subsoiler right here with a coulter attachment. And here's one that works off of a hydraulic cylinder that you can lift up, and it's on a track machine. I know if you're working in cutover land or land that's previously forested, that you're going to need something that's much heavier than what we typically use in an agricultural field. We can get away with a little bit lighter shank, perhaps, and a little bit lighter toolbar, but you get into these sites that have chunks or logging residue or something, stumps, you're going to need a machine that will get around a little bit better and not be tearing up. So that's covered in this Forest Service publication, by the way. Another thing that I've done over the years, I have fallen back almost entirely on hand planting hardwood stands. Machine planting in the western Gulf Coastal Plain probably will work much better than it does in the lower Mississippi Valley. We have so many shrink swell clays, so many wet sites, that getting a tractor in there with a big tree planter on the back of it and those big press wheels just ball up and gum up in the mud, and you cannot seal the slit. I have no animosity towards anybody, any contractor that's in the machine planting business, and I don't get any money by using hand planting versus machine planting. I'm just telling you that after some 50,000 acres under my belt and some 17 years of doing this, the results have been a lot better with hand planting. Closely supervised hand planting crews. But if you don't subsoil and you start seeing that with a hand planting crew, you're going to wish that you had have subsoiled, because that's going to be a dead tree in a couple of years. So, food for thought. This is why it's important to get the ripping correct. You're trying to eliminate that compacted zone. You're trying to create a favorable zone for that root system to grow and expand. That Ecotil subsoiler creates an inverted pyramid-shaped rip. And it's about 14 inches wide at the widest part, and it's about 16 inches long at the longest measurement. You have room to get that hardwood seedling in the ground. Our soil scientist in Mississippi, our resource soil scientist, Rachel Stout Evans, and I went back in 2011 to 5 or 6 sites that were ripped in 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10, and we measured rooting depth on each one of these sites. And you get about 2 inches more rooting depth on a ripped site versus an unripped site. So it's very important to get those root systems down there where they can explore the soil for nutrients and moisture, and it makes everything work a lot better. This is a ripped site on a lower Mississippi Valley soil after one growing season. If you notice, that site has not cracked back in that rip. It's very much sealed over, and the oust is holding here about 8 months into the growing season. We're trying to give these seedlings every advantage they can get for that first year. That's real important. The trick to this ripping is you want an implement that does not rip and jerk a bunch of clods up on the surface. You don't want all that vertical uplift. You want something that's going to seal back over. After 2 to 4 months of rainfall, you can plant this slit right here with no problem. You automatically establish your row spacing. It makes it very easy for your planters, and you eliminate 90% of your planting errors. Let me get off of subsoil in just a minute. I'll go over to seedling operations in the field. A lot of this is going to be very intuitive to you all, and I don't mean to be belaboring the point, but with hardwood seedlings, you cannot overemphasize the handling and storage aspect of it. Hardwood seedlings are very sensitive to desiccation, drying out, and temperature issues. If you have a tree planting job planned, be sure that you cover these steps right here with your contractor and that you understand them well yourself. Handling, storage, culling, root pruning, planting methods and equipment, planting technique. The culling. This is an issue that I've seen. Let me get right over here to this slide. I've seen this issue become quite contentious in the field as to who says what is a good seedling and who says it's not. This seedling here has good root collar diameter. It has plenty of lateral root mass. A lot of people would plant that seedling. I showed this particular slide for a reason. You cannot get a seedling like that in the ground very practically. It came out of the nursery with some issues. It needs to go in the ditch or in the trash pile. And I know people don't like to throw seedlings away. You either need to cull them at the nursery and get you a bag of good seedlings, or you need to cull them in the field, because you're going to have some of this right here. I tell people all the time, every peach farmer that grows peaches has some cold peaches. Not all of them make it to the grocery store. Seedlings are the same way. If you look at the Purdue University research, Dr. Jacobs and some of his folks, you will find that they recommend culling a large percentage of hardwood seedlings before they leave the nursery. Okay? Let me go backwards here just a little bit. Hardwood seedlings can easily lose 2 to 3% of their fresh weight in 1 hour at room temperature. And here again, this is one of Dr. Jacobs' data quotes from Purdue. And when I was doing research in graduate school, I experienced this. We worked in the greenhouse a lot with seedlings, and we would have to weigh the fresh weight before we would put them in a planting treatment. And you can literally see the seedlings drying out in front of you. If you're planting on a day that it's above 60 degrees and the wind's blowing and you've got low humidity, you need to be thinking about shutting that planting operation down, because you're in a race against time to get these seedlings planted, and that root to soil contact is very important. And the sooner you get them in that hole and close that hole, the more likely you're going to have a successful planting job. Just a little quickie on temperature. If you're going to store them in cold storage, 33 to 40 degrees is ideal. I do not like to think about going to a planting job without cold storage on site. it tips the scales in your favor. It tips the scales in the favor of the seedling survival, because any variable that you can control, it's when you plant that seedling. So if you have to shut down for a half a day or a day and you've got it in cold storage, you can control when you put that seedling in the ground. If that temperature gets up in this lethal zone right here, you're down to 1 or 2 hours a day of planting. You're going to be planting early in the morning, 7, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. You're going to have to shut down 11 o'clock to 3 o'clock. That midday range, you can shut that planting operation down, because you're going to have some dead seedlings. I had one tract about 8 years ago, over in Yazoo County, Mississippi. The temperature was about 66 degrees. Wind was blowing 15, 20 miles an hour. And the humidity was about 32 to 33%. I documented it in a notebook and on the calendar. I went back 5 years later. 100 trees to the acre was all that was out there that survived from the planted trees. We planted 302, so you lost 2/3 of your seedlings. I tell people all the time that we as foresters are put in a position of having to predict what's going to survive and what's not going to survive. It's like having a crystal ball. And you make that crystal ball work a lot better if you eliminate these variables. Proper seedling size, matching the species to the site, choosing your planting date where the weather's right, and watching that seedling temperature very carefully. Dr. McNulty was talking a minute ago. He showed the NOAA drought maps, and y'all saw all of his climate-related stuff. About 7 years ago, I started showing a very similar presentation to our planting partners and vendors in Mississippi. And people ask, well, how can you predict the weather? How do you know if it's going to be hot tomorrow or 2 weeks from now when we start kicking off the tree planting season? How can you predict the weather? Well, use those NOAA maps to your advantage. And there are 1 or 2 websites out there that I can share with you. One of them is called www.dryday.com, and it's a subscription service. You can get it very reasonably. It's very accurate at predicting wet spells 2 to 3 months in advance. So you've got some tools in your toolbox that you can use. Cold storage is important. You do not have to have a 48 to 52 foot cold storage trailer. You can rent these smaller units and have them on site. They are available for rental, and it's a lot easier than it was 17 years ago when I started. This type of trailer was not readily available back in the late 90s. Using closed trailers to store and transport your seedlings. Don't run up and down the road with them in the back of an uncovered pickup truck. Normally what I would do, we would use a rental truck to shuttle seedlings from the nursery that was about 1 hour away. They came out of cold storage, and we put them into cold storage. That way your seedlings were not unrefrigerated for any length of time. And make sure that your tree planting contractor has a reflective tarpaulin on site and knows how to use it. Another cull seedling issue, if you notice multiple stems coming out up here, and literally no taproot, very poorly formed seedling. This seedling should not have been planted. And I hear this all the time that, hey, we're just planting for wildlife. Why does it matter? Well, like I said earlier, it takes very little effort to do this job right. If you planted a good seedling, you could have a potential timber tree here at some time in the future. If you plant that cull, you're never going to have that. This is a 3/8 inch root collar, 8 or 9 lateral roots, 18 to 24 inches tall. That's what you're looking for in terms of a quality oak seedling. Some of the other species, a little bit different. Like I say, morphology is a tad different. Hackberry, red mulberry, persimmon, all these trees have their own unique characteristics. That's why I say get with your nursery and make sure that they understand what type of seedling you need for the job you're planting, the job you have planned. Root pruning. This is a subject that we could laugh about it or we can cry about it. NRCS early on believed that it was okay to prune all of the lateral roots off of a tree seedling to get it to fit the slit. That lateral root mass was not important. If you're ever going to root prune in the field, it needs to be extremely closely supervised. You cannot turn your planting crew loose with this. And also, if you subsoil your site, you really eliminate the need to do root pruning. This is something that just gets completely out of hand in the field if you're planting large acreages. Comes to the issue of getting the right size seedling, the target seedling you need from the nursery, and getting them to cull them, if at all possible, at the nursery before they leave. Now, planting method, planting technique. If I had my choices, I would plant every hardwood stand that I've ever planted with a planting shovel. But all of you know that a planting crew, is not going to like that. Why? It's going to slow them down. It comes to the issue of, do we get this job done right, or do we get it done fast? If you'll call Emil Gardner over at the Hardwoods lab, he will tell you that if he's going to plant research plots, he wants to plant them with this shovel right here. Another thing, if you've got compaction and you've got sites that you did not subsoil, this implement gives you the opportunity to break up that compaction and get that seedling down where it belongs and get that root collar covered up and get the lateral roots in the ground. This dibble bar right here, this is one of the KBC dibbles that's got the convex shape to it. It's 4.5 inches wide right at the toe pad right there, and it's 12 inches long this way. This dibble bar weighs 10.25 pounds. A lot of planters do not like to carry a 10.25 pound dibble bar with them. However, your results are much better planting hardwood trees with either one of these two implements than they are with a pine dibble bar. That is some 7 pounds, and it's only 3 inches wide, and it's about 8 inches long. You see the comparison there side by side. That pine planting dibble just doesn't work for hardwoods. So that's something to think about when writing your planting contract and having them bring the right dibble bar to the site. Here is a shop-made dibble that one of our contractors about 13 years ago came up with. I have no problem at all with that dibble bar right there. It has a wide blade. It's about 8 or 9 inches wide right here at the toe pad, and it's about 12 or 13 inches deep. It's built very much like a miniature planting shovel. They make this out of stainless steel, and it's lighter in weight, and they actually have to slow down to dig a hole and get that seedling in the ground. You can't just slam a tree into the ground using that dibble. You really have to dig the hole. So that's an idea. Work with your contractor and get an implement that suits the purpose, because you do not want root collar exposed, gaping open like that a month after your planting job. And here again, you can even see more exposure on that one, and a big air pocket as well with a lateral root hanging out. You just don't want to come along a month later and see these kinds of problems, because they aren't going away. And a lot of people have said over the years that these lateral roots will air prune, they'll dry back, don't worry about it. But they still don't understand when you come back 3 years, 5 years later and you got dead seedlings, what went wrong. Everybody starts looking for a reason to blame it on. So I tell people it's either the detective concept of coming back 5 years later trying to figure out what went wrong, or it's the crystal ball concept on the front end trying to predict what's going to go right. So try to tip the scales in your favor and make everything go right. Proper seedling handling and storage, culling, careful culling, work with the nursery, get good quality seedlings from the right seed source, planting technique, and have good communication with your contractors, your planting crew. There's no substitute for that. And everybody has a favorite tree that they've seen over the years. This is a nut-all oak that's 48 inches at breast height, and it's about 110 feet tall. That tree did not get that way without some competition. Natural stand dynamics pushed that tree to become a canopy dominant and even a super emergent. So think about those trainer trees and stand dynamics and what it takes to make those clear bowls and make those trees grow right. Thanks for your time and interest. The shrink swell clays, 90% of what I've planted trees on have been shrink swell clays. That's why that Ecotil subsoiler with that wing and that tiger point is so valuable, because it literally kills the memory in that clay where it will not crack back in that same plane. Okay? Now, in measuring these sites, these ripped sites some 3, 4, 5, 6 years later, we have gone back and realized that the churning or inversion or the rolling, as some literature calls it, that wing subsoiler does, the effects of that last anywhere from 8 months to a year and a half, depending on this particular site. And these soils will heal back. That clay will come back to pretty much the same structure it was, but it doesn't have that crack in it. And that's where we had so many problems early on in planting in shrink swell clays. You'd come back a year or two later, you'd see a seedling hanging by one lateral root, and you could look down in that crack and you could see halfway to China. So there's the reason for subsoiling in shrink swell clays. The only thing that I don't understand, and I'm willing to learn, if we need to change that wing a little bit or use a slightly different point for some of these Western Gulf soils, I'm certainly open to suggestions on that, or working with a farm implement dealer or a soil scientist or somebody if we need to change that slightly from the implement we're currently using. Okay? The wing makes all the difference in the world. The parabolic jerks up a lot of clods. A straight shank subsoiler just basically makes a V trench. It doesn't really go down and shatter that compacted zone. So what you're looking to do is have minimal lift, but yet shatter below the soil surface. And that Ecotil is doing all of its work down there where it matters. You are 100% correct. I have another slide, another whole presentation about that actually. Smearing versus shattering is not good. If you rip when it's too wet, it's like dragging a knife through peanut butter. You're just smearing. You aren't shattering. Shattering that compacted area is the key part. And this publication right here talks about that at a great deal of length, okay, about shattering that compacted zone. The only thing is, if it gets absolutely too dry in a drought year and you try to shatter or rip a heavy clay soil, you will get more clods up to the surface. So a little bit of moisture is not bad in these heavy clay soils. Thank you.